In 326 BC, on the banks of a river in modern-day Pakistan, a 29-year-old king stood in front of his army and asked them to keep walking east. They said no. For the first time in his life, Alexander the Great lost, not a battle, but a vote. His own soldiers, men who had followed him 11,000 miles from home, simply refused to go any further. He wept in his tent for 3 days, and then he turned around and started walking back toward a death that was already waiting for him in Babylon. This is the story of how a teenage king from a small mountain kingdom conquered the largest empire the world had ever seen, and how it all came apart in less than 13 years. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedon, a kingdom most Greeks at the time considered backward, a rough northern neighbor, not a real part of Greek civilization. His father was King Philip II, a brilliant and ruthless reformer who had spent years turning Macedon's army into the most advanced fighting force in the ancient world. His mother, Olympias, was fiercely intelligent and just as fiercely ambitious for her son, and she filled his head early with the idea that he was descended from the hero Achilles. When Alexander was 13, Philip made an unusual choice. He brought in the philosopher Aristotle to tutor his son. For the next few years, Alexander studied medicine, science, ethics, and literature, and developed a lifelong obsession with Homer's Iliad that he reportedly kept under his pillow for the rest of his life. But the most important lessons came from the battlefield, not the classroom. At 18, Alexander commanded the left wing of his father's army at the Battle of Chaeronea, the fight that crushed the combined armies of Athens and Thebes and made Macedon the unchallenged power in Greece. He didn't just watch, he led the cavalry charge that broke the elite Theban sacred band, a unit that had never been defeated in battle before that day. Then, in 336 BC, everything changed in an instant. Philip was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards. Alexander was 20 years old. Within hours, he had to prove he could hold a throne that plenty of people assumed a 20-year-old couldn't keep. Alexander moved fast and without mercy. He had rival claimants to the throne executed before they could organize against him. When the city of Thebes rebelled, believing the boy king was weak, Alexander marched south and made an example of it. The city was destroyed, its buildings leveled, thousands of its people sold into slavery. The message landed exactly as intended. Greece was not getting a second Philip. It was getting something else entirely. With Greece subdued, Alexander turned his attention to the plan his father had already set in motion before his death, an invasion of the Persian Empire, the largest and wealthiest empire on earth, stretching from Egypt to the edge of India. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with around 35,000 men. His first real test came almost immediately at the Granicus River, where a Persian force tried to stop him at the water's edge. Alexander charged in himself at the front of his cavalry and very nearly died. A Persian noble's sword strike was inches from killing him before a companion intervened. The Macedonians broke the Persian line, and the campaign was officially underway. Moving through Asia Minor, Alexander stopped at the city of Gordium, where local legend held that whoever untied an impossibly complex knot, the Gordian knot, was destined to rule all of Asia. According to the most famous version of the story, Alexander didn't bother untying it. He drew his sword and cut it in half. Whether the story is entirely true or partly legend, it became the perfect symbol for how he operated. When a problem couldn't be solved the conventional way, he simply created a new one. In 333 BC, Alexander met King Darius III of Persia himself at the Battle of Issus. Despite being badly outnumbered, Alexander's army broke the Persian lines, and Darius fled the battlefield so quickly he abandoned his own mother, wife, and children, whom Alexander then treated with notable respect, a calculated move that boosted his reputation across the region. Rather than chase Darius immediately, Alexander turned south along the coast, laying siege to the island city of Tyre for 7 brutal months until it finally fell. He then marched into Egypt, where he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but almost as a liberator from Persian rule, and crowned as pharaoh. While there, he founded a city at the mouth of the Nile that he named after himself, Alexandria, which would go on to become one of the great centers of learning in the ancient world. Then came the battle that decided everything. In 331 BC, at Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq, Darius assembled a massive army far larger than Alexander's, reportedly including scythed chariots and war elephants. It didn't matter. Alexander's tactics shattered the Persian formation. Darius fled again, and this time there was no recovery. The Persian Empire, the empire that had dominated the known world for 2 centuries, was finished as a fighting power. Alexander marched into the great cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, taking control of treasuries so vast that historians still describe the wealth in almost unbelievable terms. Darius himself was murdered shortly afterward by one of his own subordinates, fleeing the very man he could no longer outrun. With Darius dead, Alexander declared himself king of Asia. But ruling the empire he'd conquered required more than winning battles. And here, Alexander made choices that unsettled the very men who had marched with him from Macedon. He began adopting Persian customs, wearing Persian dress, and surrounding himself with Persian nobles. To his veteran officers, this looked less like smart governance and more like their king becoming the very thing they'd set out to destroy. The tension boiled over into real danger. A conspiracy against Alexander's life was uncovered, and in the aftermath, he had his own childhood friend and one of his most senior generals, Philotas, executed for alleged involvement, followed by the killing of Philotas's father, the legendary General Parmenion, who had served under Philip and helped build the very army Alexander commanded. It was a stark reminder that loyalty to Alexander now came with no guarantees, even for the men closest to him. Rather than stop with Persia conquered, Alexander pushed further east into Central Asia through brutal guerrilla campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana, modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, where his army faced some of the toughest resistance of the entire campaign. It was here that he married Roxana, a local noblewoman, partly for genuine affection and partly as a political move to bind the region to him. By 326 BC, Alexander had pushed into India, where he fought King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes, a brutal fight against war elephants that cost the Macedonians heavily, even in victory. Impressed by Porus's courage, Alexander didn't just spare him, he restored him to power as a loyal ally. And then came the river the army would not cross. At the Hyphasis, the Bees River, Alexander's exhausted, homesick troops, many of whom had been fighting for 8 straight years, refused to march any further into the unknown. This was the moment from our opening. The unstoppable king stopped not by an enemy, but by his own men. He gave in. The army turned back. The retreat was its own disaster. Crossing the Gedrosian desert on the way home, Alexander's forces suffered horrific losses to heat, thirst, and starvation. By some accounts, more men died in that desert than in any battle of the entire campaign. Back in Persia, Alexander tried to consolidate his sprawling, exhausted empire. He held a mass wedding ceremony at Susa, marrying off his officers to Persian noblewomen in an attempt to physically fuse the 2 cultures together. He planned new roads, new cities, new expeditions, including an invasion of Arabia he would never live to launch. Then, in 324 BC, his closest companion, Hephaestion, a man many historians believe was also his lover, died suddenly, likely from illness. Alexander's grief was described as devastating, almost unhinged. He reportedly ordered the execution of Hephaestion's physician and commissioned an enormous funeral pyre in his memory. Less than a year later in Babylon, after a prolonged banquet, Alexander fell ill. Over roughly 10 days, his condition worsened until, on either the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BC, he died. He was only 32 years old. The exact cause has never been settled. Malaria, typhoid fever, and poisoning have all been proposed by historians across the centuries, and the debate continues to this day. Asked on his deathbed who should inherit his empire, Alexander is said to have answered, "To the strongest." It was, in hindsight, the most accurate prediction he ever made, and also the most catastrophic. With no clear successor, his empire didn't pass to one heir. It tore itself apart. In the chaos that followed, Alexander's generals, men who had fought beside him for years, turned on each other in a brutal series of conflicts known as the Wars of the Successors. Within a couple of decades, his empire had splintered into separate kingdoms ruled by his former commanders: the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids across much of Asia, the Antigonids back in Macedon. His wife Roxana and his young son were eventually murdered as rival factions eliminated anyone with a legitimate claim to his legacy. And yet, the empire fell apart far faster than the world it created. Alexander's conquests fused Greek language, art, and ideas with the cultures of Egypt, Persia, and Central Asia, kicking off what historians call the Hellenistic period, a cultural fusion that lasted for centuries after his death. The city of Alexandria became one of the intellectual capitals of the ancient world. Greek became a common language, stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. He had spent 13 years as king. He never lost a single major battle, and by the age of 30, he had built an empire spanning 3 continents, one that began crumbling the moment he stopped breathing. Whether you see him as a visionary or simply the most successful conqueror in history, no single person before him had ever reshaped that much of the world that fast. Few ever would again.